How Christmas became America's greatest cultural invention. Imagine walking through New York City in December 1828, and you'd be terrified. There are no cheerful carols, no twinkling lights, no families exchanging gifts. Instead, gangs of young men roamed the streets, breaking into wealthy homes, demanding food and alcohol, threatening violence if refused. This isn't some dystopian nightmare. This is what Christmas actually looked like in America less than 200 years ago. The holiday we think has existed forever, the traditions we assume are ancient and sacred, are actually a brilliant Victorian invention, a carefully constructed cultural phenomenon that transformed a violent street carnival into the cozy family celebration we know today. But here's what's even more fascinating. The people who created modern Christmas weren't trying to honor ancient traditions. They were trying to solve a very modern problem, the rise of industrial capitalism and the dangerous gap between rich and poor. What they created wasn't just a holiday, it was a social experiment. And understanding how that experiment worked reveals something profound about why Christmas still has such power over us, and why we can't seem to escape its grip no matter how secular our society becomes. To understand how Christmas was invented, we first need to understand what came before it. And the answer might surprise you. The celebration we now associate with the birth of Christ has roots that stretch back thousands of years before Jesus was born, and those roots have nothing to do with Christianity. In the dark forests of northern Europe, when winter arrived and the sun seemed to be dying, ancient peoples created rituals to survive both physically and psychologically. The winter solstice, occurring around December 21st, marked the shortest day of the year, the moment when darkness had its greatest power. For people living close to survival, this was genuinely frightening. Would the sun return? Would spring come again? The Norse people created a festival called Yule to answer these questions with defiant celebration. The centerpiece of Yule was the Yule log, and understanding this tradition reveals something important about how ancient people thought about celebration. Fathers and sons would venture into the frozen forest and drag home the largest log they could find. This wasn't just about warmth, though the log certainly provided that during the 12 days it burned. Each spark that flew from the log represented a pig or calf that would be born in the spring, a form of sympathetic magic, an attempt to influence the future through ritual action in the present. But there was another element to these winter celebrations that's crucial to understanding Christmas: evergreens. In a landscape where everything appeared dead, where trees stood as bare skeletons and the earth lay frozen and barren, the evergreen tree presented a mystery and a promise. Here was life that persisted through winter's assault, proof that death wasn't final, that nature contained something indestructible. The psychological power of this symbol cannot be overstated. When you're struggling to survive a northern European winter, when you're wondering if spring will ever come, the sight of a living green plant becomes almost magical. The celebrations themselves were extraordinary, and they set patterns that would echo through centuries. During Yule, the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended. This was one of the few times of year when meat was abundant, because cattle had just been slaughtered before the long winter when they couldn't be fed. The result was feasting on a scale that wouldn't be seen again for months. But there was also darkness in these celebrations, a sense that outside the warm hall, malevolent forces prowled. In Germany, the god Odin lent his name to this midwinter festival. Odin was a terrifying figure, a god who rode through the night sky, deciding who would prosper and who would perish in the coming year. The smart choice during Odin's ride was to stay inside, to huddle by the fire, to wait for the darkness to pass. Keep this image in mind, because thousands of years later, another figure would ride through the Christmas night, but his mission would be transformed from judgment to generosity. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles to the south, Rome was celebrating its own winter festival, and in many ways it was even more elaborate than the Norse Yule. Saturnalia began a week before the winter solstice and stretched into a month-long celebration of excess. The festival was named for Saturn, the god of plenty, and plenty is exactly what Romans enjoyed. Food, drink, gambling, and a complete inversion of the social order characterized this time. Masters would dress as slaves, slaves would dress as masters, and for a brief moment, Rome's rigid hierarchy dissolved into chaos. But there was another Roman celebration that would prove even more significant for the future of Christmas. A small but powerful sect in Rome worshipped Mithras, the god of the unconquerable sun. For these worshippers, the most sacred day of the year was December 25th, the birthday of Mithras. According to their mythology, Mithras was born from a rock, and shepherds came to worship him as an infant god, born in a pastoral setting. If these elements sound familiar, there's a reason. When Christianity began spreading through the Roman Empire, it encountered a landscape already filled with winter celebrations, and the early church faced a choice: fight these traditions or absorb them. The Christian takeover. The early Christians didn't celebrate Christmas at all, and this fact is crucial to understanding the holiday's later development. For the first few centuries after Christ's death, the resurrection was everything. The birth was mentioned, certainly, but it wasn't commemorated with any special celebration. The question of when Jesus was born remained a mystery. The Bible provides no date, and certain details in the Gospel accounts suggest it probably wasn't winter at all. If shepherds were watching their flocks by night in the fields, as the Gospel of Luke describes, this almost certainly indicates a warmer season, not the heart of winter. But by the 4th century, Christianity was spreading rapidly, and church leaders recognized they had a problem. People throughout the empire were celebrating winter festivals with enthusiasm, and these celebrations showed no signs of stopping just because a new religion had arrived. The church's solution was brilliant in its pragmatism. If you can't beat 'em, join 'em. Since Rome was already celebrating the birth of the sun god Mithras on December 25th, why not declare that the same day marked the birth of the Son of God? The symbolism was perfect. Christianity proclaimed Jesus as the light of the world, and what better time to celebrate his birth than the moment when the sun began its journey back to power after the winter solstice. In the year 336, the Church made it official. December 25th became the Feast of the Nativity, and Christmas as a Christian holiday was born. But declaring a feast day and controlling how people celebrated it were two very different things. The Church soon discovered that people already had their own ideas about midwinter celebration, and those ideas were remarkably resistant to change. The Church's strategy was essentially to rebrand existing traditions rather than eliminate them. Those evergreens that Northern Europeans had been bringing inside for thousands of years, they could now represent Christ and eternal life. The Church encouraged people to decorate these branches with apples, symbolizing the Garden of Eden and humanity's fall from grace. Centuries later, these apples would become the colorful ornaments we hang on Christmas trees today. Holly, another traditional winter decoration, was reinterpreted to represent Christ's crown of thorns, with the red berries symbolizing drops of his blood. This process of absorption and transformation reveals something important about how cultural change actually works. The Church wasn't eliminating pagan traditions, it was coating them with a thin layer of Christian symbolism, while the underlying practices remained essentially unchanged. People continued to feast, to drink, to bring greenery inside, to suspend normal social rules. They just now called it a Christian celebration. The Church had gained converts, but it had lost control over how those converts celebrated. By the Middle Ages, this tension between the sacred and the profane had become Christmas's defining characteristic. On December 25th, the faithful would attend Mass in magnificent Gothic cathedrals, where they would hear the story of Christ's birth told in Latin by priests in elaborate vestments. But once they left those cathedrals, the celebration that awaited them in the streets bore little resemblance to anything religious. Medieval Christmas was loud, drunken, and chaotic. A temporary king called the Lord of Misrule would be crowned, often a beggar or student, and under his reign the normal social order would be turned upside down. The most striking aspect of medieval Christmas was the practice of wassailing, which would later evolve into Christmas caroling, but originally looked very different. Groups of peasants would descend on the homes of the wealthy, banging on doors and demanding entry. Once inside, they expected to be served the best food and drink the household had to offer. If the master of the house refused or offered inferior goods, the wassailers would threaten or actually perform destructive acts. One surviving Christmas song makes the threat explicit, warning that if demands aren't met, down will come butler, bowl, and all. This wasn't cheerful holiday spirit. This was class warfare dressed up in seasonal clothing. By the early 17th century, many religious reformers had had enough. In England, a group known as the Puritans looked at Christmas celebration with horror. They saw drunkenness where the church preached temperance, gluttony where it preached moderation, and chaos where it preached order. When Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan forces overthrew the king in 1645, Christmas became an early target of their reforming zeal. The Puritan objection to Christmas was both theological and social. Theologically, they argued that nothing in the Bible mandated celebrating Christ's birth on December 25th or any other day. The holiday had no scriptural foundation, and therefore celebrating it was a form of idolatry. Socially, they saw Christmas as a time when people indulged their worst impulses, when gluttony and lust and drunkenness reigned. In 1652, Parliament made it official. Christmas was outlawed. Shops were ordered to stay open on December 25th. Churches were forbidden to hold special services. Anyone caught celebrating faced fines or worse. But here's what the Puritans discovered. You can outlaw a holiday, but you can't eliminate the human need for celebration. Christmas went underground, but it never disappeared. If Christmas pie was illegal, people simply called it mince pie instead and ate it anyway. Secret Christmas celebrations became acts of resistance, and the holiday gained a kind of romantic outlaw status it had never possessed before. The situation reached a breaking point in 1656 when the people of Kent and Canterbury passed a remarkable resolution. They declared that if they could not have their Christmas, they would bring back the king. This wasn't just about wanting a day off or enjoying some food and drink. Christmas had become symbolic of something larger, a vision of English life and culture that the Puritans were trying to destroy. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Christmas was restored with him, and there's a strong argument that popular attachment to the holiday helped make that restoration possible. The English, it turned out, could live without a king, but they couldn't live without Christmas. Across the Atlantic, a similar drama was playing out. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were religious separatists even more orthodox than their English Puritan cousins. They had no intention of celebrating Christmas in their new colony. In 1659, the Puritans in Boston actually outlawed the holiday, imposing a fine of 5 shillings on anyone caught exhibiting Christmas spirit. But, as in England, the ban was impossible to enforce. A Boston almanac from 1719 doesn't list Christmas as an official holiday, but it does include an interesting warning for the season. Don't let your children and servants run too much abroad at night. In other words, Christmas celebration was happening whether the authorities approved or not. The ban remained on the books for decades, but its very existence proved that people were celebrating anyway. Not all American colonies shared this hostility to Christmas. In Virginia, Captain John Smith recorded that Jamestown's first New World Christmas was kept with plenty of good oysters, wild fowl, and good bread. These settlers also added a new drink to the Christmas tradition, eggnog, the nog coming from grog, which meant any drink made with rum. The divide between North and South on Christmas celebration was already forming, a divide that would persist for centuries. After the American Revolution, Christmas fell into an interesting limbo. All things English had fallen out of favor, and Christmas was seen as a British tradition. On December 25, 1789, the United States Congress sat in session, and it would continue to meet on Christmas Day for most of the next 67 years. America was a nation without holidays, and some citizens were beginning to wonder if that was a mistake. The Victorian Invention. This brings us to the moment when Christmas was truly invented, or perhaps reinvented, in the form we now recognize. The story of modern Christmas begins in New York City in the early 19th century, but the reasons for Christmas's transformation extend far beyond any single city. What was happening in New York was happening throughout the industrializing world, the creation of a new economic system that was generating wealth and poverty in unprecedented quantities. By 1820, New York had transformed from a backwater port town into America's commercial center. Great fortunes were being made, a comfortable middle class was emerging, but the Industrial Revolution had also created a new underclass, people disconnected from traditional social structures, unemployed or underemployed, and increasingly resentful. This class tension exploded every Christmas when traditional wassailing transformed into something much more threatening. In the 1820s, Christmas in New York meant gang riots. Groups of young men, many of them recent immigrants or displaced rural workers, would roam the streets, engaging in violence, vandalism, and intimidation. The situation became so serious that in 1828, the year after a particularly savage Christmas riot, New York established its first professional police force specifically to handle the holiday season. The comfortable classes were genuinely frightened, and a few influential people decided something had to change. Washington Irving, America's best-selling novelist, led the way. In 1819, he published The Sketchbook, which included a series of stories about Christmas at an imaginary English manor house called Bracebridge Hall. Irving's Christmas was everything the street carnival was not: peaceful, orderly, warm, domestic. In his stories, rich and poor mingled harmoniously. Squires welcomed grateful peasants into their homes. Everyone knew their place in the social order, and everyone was content with it. Class conflict disappeared in a haze of good feeling and roast beef. Irving's vision was enormously influential, but it took Charles Dickens to truly crystallize the new Christmas. A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, became an instant bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge's transformation from miser to philanthropist provided a template for how the middle class should think about Christmas and about their relationship to the poor. Scrooge's journey is instructive. At the beginning of the story, he refuses to acknowledge any responsibility to anyone beyond himself. When asked to contribute to charity, he suggests that the poor should go to prisons or workhouses. When his clerk asks for Christmas Day off, Scrooge grudgingly agrees, but calls it picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Scrooge represents pure capitalism, the accumulation of wealth with no sense of social obligation. But after his visitations from the three spirits, Scrooge is transformed. He doesn't become a socialist or revolutionary. He remains wealthy and in charge of his business. But he now understands that wealth comes with obligations, that he owes something to his employee and to the anonymous poor, that family and generosity matter more than accumulation. This is the Victorian compromise, and it's the heart of the Christmas idea. You can be rich, but you must be generous. You can be the boss, but you must be kind. Class distinctions remain, but they're softened by seasonal charity. There's a story about Dickens touring America and reading from A Christmas Carol. After one reading, an American factory owner reportedly told his wife that next year they would close the factory on Christmas Day. This anecdote captures something essential about the Victorian Christmas project. It wasn't about eliminating capitalism or class distinctions. It was about making them more humane, more bearable, more acceptable. But for Christmas to serve this social function, it needed to move from the streets into the home. And that required another transformation, the reimagining of childhood and family life. Before the 19th century, the family was essentially an economic unit designed to train children for productive labor. Childhood was short, and sentiment was something you couldn't afford. But as the middle class grew wealthier and work moved out of the home and into factories and offices, a new vision of childhood emerged. Children were no longer primarily economic assets. They were emotional investments, delicate creatures who needed to be nurtured in a warm, supportive environment. The home transformed from a place of production to a place of consumption and emotional fulfillment, and Christmas became the perfect holiday for this new vision of family life. Here was a time when parents could lavish attention on their children without seeming to spoil them, when spending money on gifts seemed like an expression of love rather than wasteful consumption. This shift created what we might call the invention of quality time. Parents discovered that they could take pleasure in their children's pleasure, that watching a child's face light up at a gift could be its own reward. This was genuinely new in human history, or at least new as a widespread middle-class experience. Christmas became the vehicle for this discovery, the one day when the family gathered not to work or worship, but simply to be together and enjoy each other's company. Building the tradition. But Victorian families still faced a practical problem. They now knew why they wanted to celebrate Christmas, but they didn't know how. The old carnival Christmas was clearly inappropriate for a respectable middle-class home, but what should replace it? The answer came from an unlikely source, a royal wedding. In 1840, Queen Victoria of England married her German cousin, Prince Albert. Albert brought German traditions to Windsor Palace, including the custom of decorating an evergreen tree at Christmas. The decorated tree had been common in Germany for generations, but it was virtually unknown in England. In 1848, the Illustrated London News published an engraving of the royal family gathered around their Christmas tree, and that single image transformed Christmas forever. Within just a few years, Christmas trees appeared in homes throughout England and America. What's fascinating is how quickly people forgot that the tradition was new. By the late 1850s, people were writing in their diaries about having a Christmas tree as is customary, or as we have always had, conveniently forgetting that the custom was less than 10 years old. This rapid naturalization of invented tradition reveals something important about how culture actually works. We don't need traditions to be ancient to feel their power. We just need them to feel right, to fit our emotional needs in the present. The tree's connection to the old world was actually one of its strongest selling points for Americans. These were new holiday traditions, things their parents hadn't observed, and that created a kind of anxiety. People wanted to know they were doing Christmas correctly, that they were following established customs rather than making things up. If they could say, "This is how it's done in Germany," or "This is how the English do it," that provided legitimacy. The fact that these supposedly ancient traditions were actually very recent inventions didn't matter. Other traditions appeared with similar speed. In 1828, Joel Poinsett, America's first minister to Mexico, brought back a red and green plant that seemed perfect for Christmas decoration. The poinsettia, named after Poinsett, became an instant Christmas staple. In 1843, a European firm printed the first Christmas cards, and newly efficient postal services in both England and America helped make them an overnight sensation. Suddenly, you could send Christmas wishes to distant friends and family, extending the emotional reach of the holiday. Even the risque traditions of the old carnival Christmas found their way into Victorian homes, though in sanitized form. Mistletoe, a plant associated with fertility in pagan times, became a Christmas decoration that gave people license to kiss in ways that would normally be considered improper. In the midst of Victorian propriety, here was a small outlet for flirtation and romance, a remnant of Christmas's more anarchic past. By mid-century, Christmas was everywhere in America, except in one crucial location, the church. Most Americans were Protestant, and Protestant churches had ignored or actively opposed Christmas for centuries. But the lay people were now demanding it. Victorian families wanted official religion on this sacred day, and they weren't shy about shopping around. Protestants started attending Catholic or Episcopal services to experience Christmas worship, and this put pressure on Presbyterian and Baptist and Methodist churches to provide Christmas services of their own. Gradually, reluctantly, the Protestant establishment yielded to popular demand. Creating Santa. The Victorian Christmas now had trees, cards, mistletoe, and church services, but it was still missing its most iconic figure. Santa Claus, as we know him, is perhaps the purest example of Christmas as American invention, though, like everything about the holiday, he has roots that stretch back centuries. The original Santa was Saint Nicholas, a Greek Orthodox bishop from the 4th century who became one of medieval Christianity's most popular saints. According to legend, Nicholas was extraordinarily generous, particularly to children. On December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, good children throughout Europe would wake to find gifts, while bad children received nothing. In Holland, he was known as Sinterklaas, and Dutch settlers brought tales of this gift-giving saint to America. In 1822, Clement Clark Moore, a wealthy Episcopal minister in New York City, wrote a poem for his children about this saint's Christmas visit. A visit from St. Nicholas, better known today as the night before Christmas, transformed the severe Catholic bishop into something new. A cheerful, magical figure who came down the chimney on Christmas Eve to fill stockings with presents. Moore invented the 8 reindeer, Dasher and Dancer and the rest. He invented Santa's chimney entrance. He created the image of stockings hung by the fireplace with care. But Moore was initially embarrassed by his poem. As a minister, he worried that it was too frivolous, too focused on secular magic rather than religious truth. The poem contained no mention of Christ or Christianity. It was pure fantasy, and Moore feared it might be inappropriate for a man of the church to have written it. He didn't reveal his authorship until years later, after it became clear that every child in America was enchanted by his creation. What Santa looked like, however, remained unclear for decades. Early images showed him in various forms, sometimes as a thin, severe figure in bishop's robes, sometimes as a frightening gnome, once even as a drunkard riding a turkey-drawn sleigh. In 1863, Thomas Nast, a cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, finally settled the question. Nast's Santa was round and jolly, dressed in fur, with a big white beard and rosy cheeks. He looked, in fact, like a successful Victorian businessman, someone who would fit comfortably into the robber baron era. But Nast's Santa was a robber baron in reverse. Instead of taking from the less fortunate to enrich himself, he gave to the less fortunate, expecting nothing in return. He distributed wealth rather than accumulating it. He rewarded children not for their productivity or economic value, but simply for being good, for embodying moral qualities. In an era of brutal capitalism, Santa represented a kind of generous capitalism, wealth used for benevolent purposes. Retailers quickly recognized Santa's commercial potential. Here was a figure who could sell anything while making it seem like commerce had nothing to do with it. If your gifts came from Santa rather than from a store, then you weren't really participating in the marketplace. You were participating in magic. Santa Claus allowed both children and parents to maintain the fiction that Christmas existed outside the realm of commerce, even as shopping became the holiday's central activity. By the late 19th century, Santa Claus was appearing in department stores, establishing a ritual that continues today. The experience of sitting on Santa's lap and telling him what you want for Christmas became a rite of passage for American children. The author Gene Shepherd captured this experience perfectly in his autobiographical story, A Christmas Story, where a young boy prepares for weeks to tell Santa he wants a BB gun, only to freeze up when confronted with Santa's impressive presence and end up requesting a football instead. In 1939, Robert May, a copywriter at Montgomery Ward, created Santa's most famous helper, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. May's story about an ostracized reindeer whose disability becomes an asset perfectly captured the inclusive spirit that Christmas was supposed to embody. Rudolph, the underdog, the outsider, the one who doesn't fit in, saves Christmas through the very characteristic that made him different. The story resonated so powerfully that it became a permanent part of Christmas mythology, spawning songs, television specials, and countless adaptations. The meaning of Christmas. So what does all of this history tell us about Christmas today? Why does this holiday have such power over us, even in an increasingly secular society? Why can't we seem to escape its influence, even when we find aspects of it overwhelming or commercialized? The answer lies in understanding what Christmas actually is. Not an ancient religious tradition, but a solution to a modern problem. The Victorians invented Christmas to address the social tensions created by industrial capitalism, to provide a way for families to bond in a world where work was increasingly separate from home, to give meaning to childhood in an era when children were becoming emotional rather than economic investments, and to create a space where generosity and community could flourish even in a competitive, individualistic society. Christmas works because it addresses real human needs. We need times of celebration, especially in the darkest part of the year. We need excuses to connect with family and friends. We need rituals that mark the passage of time and give structure to our lives. We need permission to be generous without seeming foolish. We need moments when normal social rules are suspended and we can express affection more freely than usual. Christmas provides all of this. The tension between the sacred and the secular that people worry about has always been part of Christmas. From its earliest days as a Christian holiday, Christmas has combined religious observance with celebration that has nothing to do with religion. The trees, the gifts, the feasting, the decorations, these aren't Christian practices, they're human practices, ways we mark important transitions and create meaning in our lives. The religious element gives Christmas depth and significance for many people, but the secular elements are what allow the holiday to spread beyond any single faith tradition. The commercialization that people complain about is also baked into Christmas's DNA. From the moment Victorians decided that Christmas should be about giving gifts to children, commerce became central to the holiday. You can't have a gift-giving celebration without shopping, and once shopping becomes important, retailers will inevitably capitalize on it. The question isn't whether Christmas should be commercial. The question is whether we can maintain a balance, whether we can shop without letting shopping consume everything else. What's most remarkable about Christmas is how thoroughly it has succeeded at its original purpose. The Victorians wanted to create a holiday that would bring families together, soften class tensions, and provide an annual reminder that generosity matters. Nearly 200 years later, Christmas still does all of those things. 98% of Americans celebrate Christmas in some form, making it the closest thing we have to a universal cultural experience. Churches fill on Christmas Eve in ways they don't the rest of the year. Families travel enormous distances to be together. People who are normally focused on accumulation and competition take time to think about what they can give to others. Christmas isn't ancient, but it doesn't need to be. It works not because it's old, but because it meets real human needs in the present. Understanding that Christmas was invented doesn't diminish it. If anything, it makes the holiday more impressive. The Victorians looked at the social problems of their era and created a cultural solution that has lasted for generations and spread around the world. That's not a failure of authenticity. That's a triumph of cultural innovation. So the next time you decorate a tree or hang stockings or listen to carolers or watch It's a Wonderful Life, remember that you're participating in traditions that are both very new and very old. The specific forms are Victorian inventions, but they draw on human needs and impulses that go back thousands of years. Christmas is an invented tradition that has become real through our collective participation in it. And that, perhaps, is the real Christmas miracle, our ability to create meaning together, to build traditions that matter, to make something out of nothing except our need for light in the darkness and our capacity for joy.